Good evening and welcome to Business Week at Birkbeck, hosted by the School of Business, Economics and Informatics. Business Week is our annual showcase of our research in the school and in which we explore contemporary business issues with keynote speakers. And it's my pleasure to, in a second, introduce the first of those keynote speakers. Firstly, our theme for this week is sustainable working life and well-being, and each of the days of this week is dedicated to one aspect of this, and today is the Computer Science and Information Systems Day, and the lecture that we are about to hear is the Andrew Booth Memorial Lecture. Andrew Booth was one of the UK's earliest computer scientists, although he wouldn't have called himself that, but he did build one of the earliest computers in Britain. It's my pleasure this evening to introduce Ken Olisa OBE, who is a 40-year veteran in the IT industry, started when he was 3. He has a long, distinguished career working at IBM and Wang, and he founded Interregnum, a technology merchant bank, and then Restoration Partners. Ken is ideal for our Business Week speech because he has an unconventional outlook on life and an unconventional career, and that's what we value at Birkbeck. So, without much further ado, Ken Olisa, Ritual Right, the Technologist's Dilemma. Okay.
Well, thank you, Philip. That was going quite well until the bit about unconventional. I always thought I was completely normal. Hey-ho. Well, when Roger Johnson, who's down here at the front, and you will all, I'm sure, know, because he's something of a legend here in the technology department, asked me whether I would come and give the Andrew Booth Memorial Lecture, I was, as we say in English, deeply honoured, which is, translated into proper English, massively flattered. Why on earth would somebody as important as Roger and Birkbeck ask me to do that? But I said yes, because I'm that sort of bloke. And then, and I didn't know anything about Mr. Booth, Professor Booth, I only knew about Birkbeck. Then I got this document, which many of you may or may not have seen, I don't know, the Fourth Man. It's a monogram on the great man, on Andrew D. Booth, written by, again, the famous Roger, who's now blushing down at the front, who obviously briefed you to say that I was unconventional. And when I read this, I, as we say in England, English went from being just sort of merely honoured to being humbled, which for those of you for whom English is your native language will know, translated means actually I panicked. Because Andrew Booth was a superstar in the history of British computing. And the idea that I might be asked to come along and give a memorial lecture in the context of that, I have to say, is deeply humbling, but also a massive exposure for me, because if I get this wrong and say stupid things, I will have just undermined his record, I suppose, but more importantly, I should look like a complete plonker, albeit an unconventional plonker. And it gets even better, because as Philip just said, I'm a 40-year veteran, starting at the age of slightly older than 3. I was actually born, this is a terrible thing to say, looking at all of these young faces, I was born 1 year before Andrew Booth finished his first proper computer. Actually, it's not called Ape, it's called the Aper, but the Ape machine that he created. And I think about that. So in my lifetime, we've gone from a period in technology where this man, Andrew Booth, was inventing ways of addressing memory, storing information on drums, doing multiplications electronically, to the world we live in today with Facebook and the age of ubiquity and so on. So in one sense, I mean, I would say I'm quite old, but in one sense, I'm also enormously privileged. Because there aren't many people that can say they've lived in their lifetime from their horse-drawn carriages to Formula One racing cars, or from sailing ships to sailing ships. I mean, I'm so lucky to have lived in a period of time when we've gone from no computing to the world now where we take it so much for granted. I wrote my first program in 1968 as a sixth former at school in Nottingham, and I went to the Nottingham University to do it, where we had an Atlas computer. Actually, we didn't have an Atlas computer. We had terminals connected to an Atlas computer in Manchester. And it was said that when the Atlas computer in Manchester went down, half of the UK's computing power went down, because that's the limit of computing that we had at the time. And I found it unbelievably exciting, and I hope you who are doing information sciences find it equally exciting, unbelievably exciting and thrilling to be able to get a machine to do something that if I hadn't tried, it wouldn't have done anything. I wrote my program in Algol, and I went up to Cambridge in the early 70s when Cambridge had just given up its Atlas II, the Atlas I was the one up in Manchester, and was taking an IBM computer. And it was as if the Marxists had taken over. There was absolute anger inside Cambridge that we were no longer making our own computers and were buying them from a computer maker. So I started out in that bizarre time when the business of computing was basically very primitive. There were very few companies making computers, there were very few computers, nobody really outside a very narrow sphere knew what a computer was or what a computer could do. It's hard to imagine. You have to just go back and think people did not know what they were. And that meant it must have been very difficult if you were inventing a computer and you went home to a cocktail party to explain to people what you'd been doing. They would have no concept. Magnetic drum memory, what on earth could that possibly be? The words would mean something, but not when they're all put together. And I just can't overemphasize how unbelievably primitive life was in the computing industry back at that time. One of my customers when I was a salesman was a man called Alan Lacey, and he worked at a company called Lyons Tetley. Now, this is important because Lyons, Lyons Tetley was a tea company, but Lyons had corner shops, restaurants, and other food and beverage things. They also, at Lyons, invented a computer, the Lyons Electronic Office, the Leo. And it was the first commercial computer in the UK. So I want you again to think about how things have changed. Back then, in what were the 50s and 60s, the 50s, a company whose main business was tea shops decided that computing was the thing and had their own computer made with their own people. And Alan Lacey told me a story which for me epitomizes the cynicism that those of you who are going to start businesses in computing or are in computing as a profession are going to have to face. Because he told the story about going to the unveiling of Leo 2, the second of them, because nobody thought about fancy names for computers in those days. And the man who invented this thing stood on the stage in a room rather like this with 200 or 300 accountants, who were the people that ran the business of Lyons, all sitting there. He was in his white coat. He said, I'm going to demonstrate to you the future. I am going to show to you the power of electronic computing. He said, I'm going to ask Mr. Perkins, who's sitting at a teletype keyboard, to type in a very, very large number of farthings. And the computer will calculate that in pounds, shillings, and pence. Now, I must just quickly explain, looking around the room, once upon a time in my life, up until 1971, that's how the currency was in this country. You had a pound, a shilling, and pennies. There were 240 pennies to the pound. I used to know things like 6 and 8 pence is a third of a pound, all kinds of things you just knew. And it was a very complicated time when the rest of the world was decimal. But there we were, demonstrating the power of the computer. He said, Mr. Perkins, I want you to type in a very, very large number, and the computer will calculate what that large number is in farthings into pounds, shillings, and pence. Mr. Perkins, he said, type in 1 million. So Mr. Perkins starts to type in 1 to his keyboard, 0, 0, 0, and an accountant called out 1,041 pounds, 13 shillings, and 4 pence. So there we were, man versus machine in the 60s, or the 50s rather, as it was. That was the world that I grew up in. Actually, there's an interesting coincidence, because I wrote my first commercial program when I worked for IBM in 1971, when we were moving from pounds, shillings, and pence to pounds and pence, going decimal. And the program that I wrote converted pounds, shillings, and pence into pounds and pence. And I shudder to think, but I bet it's still running somewhere every night in a batch program mode, somewhere in the company in Nottingham. Those people in the industry then lived in a very different time from the world that you operate in today, self-evidently. But their motivations were therefore very different from the ones that you're operating in today, self-evidently, because what they had to do then was to beat the technological barriers that meant things weren't possible. You loaded a program in the computer, when you turned the computer off, everything disappeared. Now we just turn it on, we get impatient if it takes more than a second or two for a computer to fire up. It's very, very different. So the reason I mention that is the motivation of those people is very different from the motivation of you. And those of you who are thinking of moving into a business using technology, I'm going to argue that what you shouldn't do is do what they were trying to do. You should try and do something quite different. And that tension between, do I want to be right, break down the barriers of technology, or do I want to be rich, is the paradox that I want to explore. I'm going to explore it by reposing the question, then comparing and contrasting two heroes in our industry today, in technology today, and then show how, although they appear to be very different, and they are very different, they don't have to be, and with a little bit of magic, we can see they've got the same objectives. And those of you who are in technology and are contemplating starting a business, those of you in business and wanting to deal with technologists, if you can square this circle and make it not a paradox, my argument tonight is that you will be far more successful. And then I want to move to the ethical dimension of this and remind you why it's important to get this right. I'll start out by borrowing from Shakespeare and just reposing the question. But the issue is, what's important here? Is it money? Is it being rich? Or is it breaking down those scientific boundaries and demonstrating to everybody that you are cleverer than everyone else? I was at a dinner in Cambridge. There were 4 of us in a little room off the main hall. There was some event going on in the hall, and we'd been at committee meetings. And I knew the man on my left, but not the 2 men to my right. And we're chatting away, and you do, and the man to my right was fairly quiet. But the man on his right was his host and wanted to introduce us properly. And he said, this man is a mathematical genius. Well, everybody in Cambridge says things like that, so that doesn't get you very much further forward. And he said, tell Mr. Olisa about what you have discovered. And this man said, I have discovered a material that when you stretch it, it expands. So I looked at him and I thought probably what you're all thinking, no, that's not possible. We know that when you stretch something, it gets thinner, it doesn't get thicker. So I said, because it's Cambridge, you get away with this, that's not possible. He said, yes, it is. I've actually made a prototype and it works. So I've lost the first bit of the argument. So I said, well, okay, how is that possible? Because that doesn't seem to be possible. He said, I've invented a material which consists of lots of levers. So when you pull it, they lever against each other and it expands. And his host said, well, it's fantastic, isn't it? This man is a genius, as I said. Think of all of the applications, Ken. Well, I'd already started to think of applications, because it's the way one's mind is supposed to go. I'm sure you're doing the same thing. And he said, you know, the foam that gets bent around the nose of an aircraft, well, it will now expand to fill this void, etc., etc. So I thought, this is wonderful. I said to this man, have you patented your invention? And he said, and I quote, good God, no. I want this to be available for the good of mankind. And I remember turning back to the man on my left, and we had the rest of the conversation on this side of the table, because he was determined to be famous for being right and was dismissing the concept of being rich. And I'm going to show you that that view is wrong, and actually being right and rich are compatible. And let's do it by looking at these two. You'll know who they are, hopefully. One of them is Mark Zuckerberg, undeniably rich. The other one is Tim Berners-Lee, undeniably right and very famous. Now, I borrowed it from Wikipedia because it saves time, but you should know both of these men. But just to get you up from the Wikipedia bit, here are their 2 short bios. The summary of them is that Berners-Lee is absolutely right. He invented a rather important part of the internet, and we all use it and take it for granted and are very grateful. And Mark Zuckerberg is undeniably rich. He invented something trivial by comparison called Facebook. However, it has made him an extremely large amount of money, and he's made lots of other people huge amounts of money. Those who work for him, those who use Facebook, etc. So I couldn't find, I don't think, a better stretch of the rich and the right in the universe. Now, before I go on, I'd just like you to think, I'm not going to ask you to put your hands up and answer it, but I'd like you just to think about which of those 2 you most identify with. which one do you find the more attractive? I don't mean physically, for those confused by the question, I mean mentally. Well, the problem I would say of these two is that Mark Zuckerberg appears, and I don't know him, but he appears not to care very much about the wealth and so that the health of society. He is not stamping around trying to do good. I think there is now a Zuckerberg Foundation. That's not surprising. But I have to say in America that's probably more for tax reasons than for anything else. Whereas Tim Berners-Lee is the man who stood up at the Olympic ceremony and represented all that's good about science and invention and frontiers. I have to say they both look very pleased with themselves, so clearly they've got some commonalities there. Well, let's see whether we can't achieve my objective of squaring that circle. I'm not going to solve the problem for these two men. I'm trying to solve it for you, our audience, this evening. Well, I'm going to do it by borrowing from Maslow, and I've already met one psychologist here this evening, so here's another go for those of the others of you here. But you will all know the Maslow hierarchy, I hope, Maslow hierarchy of needs. His argument, if you don't know him, is very simple, that we're all exactly the same, and there's a stack of needs that we have, at which the lowest level is physiological, food, oxygen, etc. The next level is safety, i.e. we're not being attacked, we're not freezing to death, up to self-actualization, a horrible word, but it's his word and he invented this idea, which is that sense of having achieved something of well-being, of satisfaction, and so on. And his argument, which is, in my experience, has stood the test of time, is that it is a hierarchy, and if you don't feel loved and belonging to something, then you won't feel self-esteem and you certainly won't feel self-actualized. If you are starving and freezing to death, the rest of these things don't matter. So the argument is quite a strong one. When you look at those two self-satisfied men on my slide before the last, and deservedly self-satisfied, they're major achievers, they clearly don't have to worry about food or safety or belonging or being, I assume, being loved. They certainly don't have to worry about self-esteem, as you could see from the smiles on the pictures that I took. So what they're both driven by is trying to achieve the best possible outcome from a self-actualization perspective. So one might be rich and going for money, and one might be right and going for being correct, but they're both trying to demonstrate in their own way self-actualization. And that's enormously important because that allows us to start to square the circle between the two. Let's examine a scientist in a little bit more detail and see what drives a scientist. There's something here which we call at Restoration Partners the scientist cycle. A scientist has a theory. They have an idea about something, internet protocol, how you might connect lots and lots of machines together. They turn that into a hypothesis. It would be done in this sort of a way. They then experiment. They observe the outcome of the experiment. That either confirms the theory or questions it, and they go round that loop again. And the ultimate prize is a Nobel Prize, of course, and the negative or the dampener or the brakes on this is all those other people out there who are trying to tear you down because they're academics, but the peer review, and outside is the broader community. So the scientist is destined, the Tim Berners-Lee of this world, to travel round and round that cycle. The entrepreneur, on the other hand, has a similar but quite different cycle. The entrepreneur has an idea about how to make money. And he or she does some research into how to make the money. They then put together some kind of a plan. They resource the plan. They implement the plan. They discover it didn't work perfectly. That changes the idea a little bit. They do a bit more research on the idea and round that cycle. So we've got two. I can't do this. We've got two cycles. Got it. We've got two cycles that they are destined to go round, but they are quite different because the prize for the entrepreneur is to turn their idea, Facebook, into a massive amount of money, the exit. The scientist prize is a Nobel Prize. So they are quite different. Now, Nobel Prize, those of you who are aspiring to get one, does actually cough up quite a lot of money, so it's not entirely a poor man's outcome, but it's not the same as being a billionaire. So we've got two quite different objectives here in different cycles. And those are often characterized, I would argue mistakenly, as being a tension between I'm driven by value, I want to be rich, money, or I'm driven by vindication, I want to prove that I'm right. I knew this would transform the something. My material that when I stretch it, it gets bigger rather than less. See, I proved to everybody and I've been confirmed with a Nobel Prize. That tension is a tension posed in the question of this evening, rich or right. At Restoration Partners, when somebody comes in, a wannabe entrepreneur, with their business idea, we always ask them, do you want to be rich or do you want to be right? Because if they want to be right, and people say things like, well, I'm going to prove that Bill Gates got it wrong and there's the right way to do something, there's no opportunity for me and my firm to make any money out of that. Because throwing investment money at someone just to prove that they're right isn't going to turn into a huge profit unless you get unbelievably lucky. It's a little bit like somebody saying, I don't want to score goals at football, I just want to run around the field. And so the rich or right question is a hugely important one. Very occasionally, we are able to persuade people that actually they can be both. But usually, it's set in their minds. So I say this to you because if you come at this and you think Tim Berners-Lee is a really exciting person and you admire him, then you're definitely on the right side of this. If on the other hand you think that Zuckerberg got it wrong and you can make more money than him, that's all right. That means you're on the rich side of this. So you have to keep reminding yourself which of those two things you are. Are you on the value side or the vindication side? But I want to square that circle and say you can be both. I do it with one of my favorite constructs, the Boston grid. Let's take value and vindication as the two dimensions, not now extreme opposites, but as two dimensions. It is possible to be tall and wide at the same time. You can go for value and vindication at the same time. Then I've got the four quadrants here. I don't care about value and I don't care about vindication. Well, that's not what we're talking about today. I do care about value, square one, and I don't care about vindication. I am extreme rich as my ambition. I don't care about value, but I do care about vindication, square four. I'm extreme right in my discussion. And I'm saying, but square two is the one to go for. And it's possible to do both of those things. But you have to be careful how you do it. Because if you think about this, if you're not careful, you end up messing up which quadrant you're in and misunderstanding what's motivating you to make something happen. So I go back to my earlier point about whether you favor Tim Berners-Lee or Mark Zuckerberg. That's whether you want to be a square one person or a square four person. The answer, I think, though, is to be neither of those things. It's to be a square two person and to work out how the two things can be happily put together. And I would say one of the challenges in this country is that lots and lots of people think they're entrepreneurs, but actually they're not. What they're really trying to do is just prove that they're right and keep going by raising money and borrowing money and getting grants. And there are other people who think, well, you know what, I can just go out and make loads of money and I don't care whether the thing that I've got makes sense or doesn't make any sense. And those are incompatible. They're doomed to, they're not incompatible, they're doomed to failure. I see lots of business plans at Restoration Partners. Day in and day out, people send in their business plans. And what I see in those business plans, and I caution all of you who are thinking about this, is people who know in their heart of hearts they ought to want to be rich. So they've called it a business plan. But actually what they really want to do is to be right. And they've invented something or they've conceived of something and they want people to go, wow, I'd never thought of that, that's fantastic. What, you pull it and it gets bigger? Wow, full stop. As a wow, how do you make it turn into money? And what we see at Restoration Partners is people who write a business plan in words at the front and they have loads of spreadsheets at the back showing the numbers of what they're going to do with the business. And the only connection between the front and the back is the staple. Because they've not thought through how those wordy things are going to turn into numbers or how those numbers are going to be delivered by actions. I would say that if you've got something that you think you're right about, you've got the passion for what it is that you've invented, you want to be right, you should also want to be rich. So I'm arguing tonight that square two is the one that everybody should be aiming for. And what you don't want to be is a sad scientist stuck in the wrong box, thinking actually you're going to be a business person. Now, I'm being slightly rude because I'm sure all of you aren't like any of these things, but every one of you that's got a really good business idea that's based on technology, the question you've got to ask yourself now is what's actually driving me? Is it the Berners-Lee logic or is it the Zuckerberg logic? And Ken is saying tonight, actually, it should be neither of those. It should be a combination of the two. Because if you don't, we'll end up with lots and lots of people, like Andrew Booth, thinking they're breaking down the scientific barriers, when in fact the scientific barriers have been broken down, and the opportunity in the 21st century is to take advantage of them rather than to just invent small incremental steps in the science. That will be done by other people, but it won't get you to be anything other than marginally satisfied. I once met a man who'd invented a way of translating languages, English into a foreign language and vice versa, and he was probably right. He just had invented it in a time when computers were so underpowered, we never knew whether he was right or not, because it would take forever to translate 3 or 4 words into 3 or 4 words, a 3 or 4 word sentence into 3 or 4 words in another language. Now, he was probably right in the way that it worked. He had no hope of ever being rich because it was impractical. It's a little bit like trying to land a jet in a grass airfield. It's a pointless thing to do. But he was just so driven by the intention to be vindicated and to be right. So the big message tonight for you is try to get to square 2 and not to squares 1 or 4. And don't be a loser by going for square 3, obviously. So square 2 is where you are trying to get yourself. Now, why does it matter? Well, it matters because this is a graph showing the UK, but it could be any country almost at the moment. It shows the GDP growth rate over time. It goes back just to 2008. And you all read the FT, I'm sure, because you're studying business, interested in it. So you know what's happening. We are in recession, we're not in recession, things are going up, we're going down. The application of technology and the creation of businesses is the only way that the planet can generate wealth. So my man who's invented that material that no one is going to use because they can't patent it because he invented it, and so they're never going to be able to protect it, and he's not going to patent it, so he's never going to use it, has invented something which is highly unlikely to get into practical use. So he's right, he's done something which has confounded everybody, but he's wrong because it won't create any wealth. And if we don't create any wealth, this sawtooth graph will continue to look as sad as it looks at the moment. Now, I've chosen a UK dimension. As I say, there are a couple of other nations in the world that don't quite fit within this, but Brazil is now struggling, and so I think actually this is the global phenomenon. For us to be able to feed ourselves and our children and our grandchildren, we need to generate wealth. But I think we need to generate wealth by moving the boundary forward all the time. And I would argue that although Mark Zuckerberg is clearly driven only by money, and he's now disappointed by how much his wealth has collapsed, he has, by accident, proved lots of things are right. He's changed the way we are able to do things on the world. When I started selling computers in the early 70s, I had to go to trading estates and ring doorbells of offices and go in and see whether people would like to buy something from me. Now you can sell things to half the planet using Facebook. So he's done what Andrew Booth was doing. He's pioneered a fundamental change in the way we use and apply technology. In his case, perhaps by accident, but he was driven by making money, and it's been the byproduct. And we've got to create wealth if this kind of graph isn't the kind of graph that persists. And if this kind of graph persists, then that maintains poverty, it maintains social dysfunction, etc., etc. So my ethical argument is, for those of you who are driven only by being right, that's a shame, because you are unlikely to be generating wealth. And those of you who are driven only by wanting to be rich and haven't thought about the implications of that, you're also wrong, because being rich whilst it's generating wealth is not as good for everybody as moving the ball forward in the way that Zuckerberg has done. But all of this was well expressed and summarized in my last slide here by an American who used to work for me. He heard me talking about rich or right at something, then we went to another meeting and I talked about rich or right to somebody else. And then somebody came in with some mad idea that he got where the logic was very poor, and I gave the third position on rich and right, and I gave a shorter version of what I've said this evening. And Tad was his name. Americans always have great names, but Tad was his name. And he took me into the room as this man had gone with his mouldy business plan off to find somebody else who might lend him £5,000 to indulge his invention. And Tad said to me, "But Ken, surely if you're rich, you're right by definition." And you know what? The Americans have a lot to teach us, and I think that's a very profound line. So ladies and gentlemen, to wrap up what I wanted to say tonight is, as you are thinking about your next idea, whether you are a scientist trying to invent the technology, the IT equivalent of a material that when you stretch it, it gets bigger, or you're a wannabe entrepreneur who wants to be richer than Mark Zuckerberg, you need to think about how you get yourself into the correct quadrant of that model. Otherwise, I think you'll find that life is much more difficult than it needs to be. That's a very simple message. We all need the wealth to happen. I wish you all very well with that. And I'd now like to hand over and take any questions you may have. Yes. He said with relief. I think there are two different kinds of animals, and I wouldn't want the deep scientist to think that he or she has to become a business person to survive. Because actually, being a business person, those of you who are business people know it's actually quite difficult. It's a full-time job. So being a business person is that. In a sense, your husband's got it right, because he's not pretending to be anything other than he is, which he wants to move the ball forward. He wants to be right. That's better than pretending to want to be rich when actually all he's trying to do is to move the ball forward. So, the argument that he lost with you on the floppy disk bit, in a sense, at least he was being true to his values and principles. Our job, those of us who are able to generate wealth, is to help those people feel satisfied on their cycle, so they continue to go round and round what is a noble cycle, but they don't stand in the way of the conversion of their invention into generating wealth. So my Cambridge mathematician irritation with him is that he's invented something which he's stopping the generation of wealth by not patenting it, and therefore not licensing it, and therefore not doing those other things. So no, I'm very happy to keep the brainy scientists doing brainy scientist things, as long as they don't stop me then turning their brainy science ideas into value. And if you are a taxpayer and you're putting money into the university system, educating people to then go and invent those things, I think we have a reasonable expectation that will be reciprocated and turned into wealth. So no, this may not be the right answer for marital relations, but don't try to change your husband. I suspect you've already given up on that. But do capture the energy that is that inventive streak. And he may not be able to come up with the answer. He may be going around his Nobel Prize cycle, so someone else has to observe that experiment and pick out the valuable pieces and turn them into wealth. But don't let him control that. Oh, I don't know your husband, he's possibly very good at this, but don't let him control that, because there are lots of people who say, but no, that's a terrible thing. I just want to invent cleverer and cleverer things for the good of society. Well, you know what? They're missing the point. Because you invent them and they don't get used, it doesn't do any good at all. So no, keep him in the basement, feed him whatever he needs, but then exploit the ideas.
Thank you.
How long have you been married?
Years.
Okay, right, moving on. You don't need any advice from me then. So, yes. The nation that's getting it right from a PR perspective, even if the reality is slightly less evident, is Israel, without doubt. And Israel has got an interesting ecosystem where you go in the military, because everyone does national service, lots of people go into technology in the military, do whatever they do there, and then come out and find a fairly good venture capital industry which looks for clever people and brings them ideas and gets them to make something happen. So I think from a national perspective, I will put Israel at the top of the list. Silicon Valley, which isn't a nation, although they would contest that, but Silicon Valley's also got an ecosystem that works rather well. But as soon as you get outside Silicon Valley, you get back to more normal, as it were, i.e. British, more British behaviour. And then we've got little pockets here. So there is a vortex in Cambridge that thinks this way. There's one in Scotland, etc. But the answer to your question is Israel. The short answer to your question is Israel. Yes? Irritatingly, the latter is becoming increasingly important, and there's as everybody knows, I'm sure, there's a game now being played by people, patent trolls, who all they do is own patents and stop people doing things, which is obviously antithetical to my point about generating wealth. So there is a tension. The US is considering changing their patent law not to outlaw this, but to make it more difficult for companies to do. However, I should declare an interest here. I'm a director of Thomson Reuters, and we provide we provide all kinds of services to scientists doing patent searches and so on. So I'm clearly very keen on it. But there isn't much point in reinventing the wheel. So the answer is, marginally reinventing the wheel might be satisfying to someone who's not thinking about anything other than the joy you get from marginally reinventing the wheel. And checking whether wheels have already been invented seems to me to be self-evident. If you're that clever, you should be able to go and just check whether someone's already had that idea and done it. In terms of generating wealth, I would imagine the most depressing circumstance for anybody is to have a jolly good idea, invent it, get some money, start to exploit it, and then be hit by some kind of writ from someone saying you're infringing my patent. That would seem to be the antidote of self-actualization and send you cascading back down to the bottom of Maslow. So my advice to anybody is, once you've started to think through what your idea is, at least a peremptory search of patents and other IP is necessary. And again, but it's a really good question, lots of people don't care because they're just going to reinvent that. I met a man the other day who said he made his first steam engine when he was 8. Now, the great thing about making a steam engine when you're 8 is you're not trying to invent the best steam engine in the universe, you're just trying to do it to prove you can make a steam engine. That seems to me to be, especially when you're 8, quite a noble thing to be doing. When you're in your 20s and 30s and 40s and your family livelihood depends on you not wasting time reinventing steam engines, I think it behooves you to go and check those things out. So a lot of wealth is destroyed by people inventing something where they discover actually its application is illegal because they're infringing a patent. That being said, it's a jungle of patent management. And so back to our earlier discussion and Mr. Booth, the closer you can get in the right part of this universe, the leading edge, the safer you are by definition. But you raise a really good point. It's what I've just described isn't easy. That's why one shouldn't waste time doing the wrong thing, because that is already difficult enough. So a scientist who wants to become a business person, possibly not a good idea. A business person who wants to become a scientist, risible. A scientist who wants to do something and hasn't bothered to check whether it's been done by somebody else, dumb. So yes, there are paths. There's another Boston grid emerging there of things that people should and shouldn't do. But you raise a very good point. Reinventing the wheel, not a short path to wealth. It's probably a Chinese proverb, yes. Yes. It's another very good question. The answer is yes, sorry. In case I die before I give you the longer answer, yes. But, and the but's quite complicated, there are two ways, two paths. There's the science route, and huge amounts of taxpayer money goes into the technology board and so on, which is basically science focused. Nesta is another organization which helps innovators think things through. They both tend to be grant focused. So I would say that's non-commercial. And then the other one is the venture capital centered universe, which is not particularly strong, but does exist. Both connect in with the university. So both will be able to talk to the university tech transfer department, etc. So there are two different paths to go down. The grant path is more the right than rich path. The venture capital one is more the rich than right path. But I'm saying you can square those, so it doesn't really matter which path you start down, as long as you recognise it's only a path, it's not the only way to get to your end objective. But the Technology Strategy Board hands out large amounts of advice and money, has a very, very good website. Nesta, the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts, hands out large amounts of money, sometimes equity, sometimes debt, and has a very, very, very good website and a whole network around them. As I say, a university tech transfer department will connect there. Venture capital is less structured, but there are lots of people in the venture capital world and connected with it trying to find ideas and to promote them. And what they can do that the other lot can't do so well is link you into Hewlett-Packard or Facebook or Apple or somebody if they think your idea is what those people are looking for. So it's horses for courses, and in the early days either will do. But the answer to the question is still yes, and those are two good places to start. So that was Nesta, National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts, and the Technology Strategy Board. This is obviously the rich side of the room. Would you like to move over? Yes? Well, if I can turn that into a strategic question, how do you do a business strategy? We say, at Restoration Partners, the way you define a business strategy is first of all to answer two questions, which we stole from Roger Martin of the Rotman School, but then our answer is our own. The two questions are, where am I going to play and how am I going to win? So the metaphor is obviously sport, but if you want to win at croquet, you have to find out where croquet is being played to be the world champion croquet player, if there is such a thing. And then you have to work out your tactics and how you're going to beat the other people to be able to win. Business is the same. So the first question is where you're going to play, how you're going to win. Which market segment or segments are you going to be playing in, and then how you're going to be number one or number two in those segments. Because if you're not winning, and you're very vulnerable. So those are the first two questions. But we say the answer to that, the framework way of answering that question, then is to say, so what's my destination? Am I trying to create a business that is worth £1 million in 3 years' time? Am I trying to create a business worth £1 billion in 10 years' time? What am I trying to do? And you need to have an answer to that question. What do I want this thing to be worth, and by when? When you've got that answer, you've now defined your destination. So to switch metaphors from sport to travelling, you've now defined your destination. So let's say, for example, I want to make this business. I want to be rich, and I want in 5 years' time to have £10 million of my own in the bank. So I know I'm going to be diluted when I sell the company, when I get investment in the company rather. So I need my company to be worth at least £20 million in 5 years' time. That's my ambition, but I'll settle for half of that. So I want the company to be worth between 10 and £20 million in, let's say, 3 to 5 years' time. That's my destination. Now what I have to do to make getting that destination a chance, a likelihood of it happening. And that's when I have to answer the questions, how am I going to win, where am I going to play, how am I going to win? So I figured that out. I've got this square floating around on a graph with time going one dimension and value in the other. So I've got my two value lines, I've got my two time lines, I've got a square there. How do I get to that square? And now I start to answer the other questions, which is, do I need to raise capital now? Do I need to raise capital later? What values can I sustain or can't I sustain? Because depending on that, I'm either going to be worth 10 or 20 or not. I'm going to have 50% or 25 or 10 or whatever. So you can start to figure out what you have to do to get there. A journey is the best possible metaphor for a strategy. If you said, I want to get to the Cotswolds for lunch, then you've defined a geographic area, not a pinpoint place, and you've defined a time, sort of 12:15 to 2:30. That's when I want to get there. Business people make a huge mistake when they put their business plans connected by the staple together of saying, well, I'm starting in Birkbeck College, and I'm going to drive out of the gates and down the road, and then I'm going to figure out what I do next, and I wonder where that will get me. Well, that's not really planning a journey. You need to figure out your destination and then figure out how to get there. So, which comes first is it can only be answered once one's figured out the destination. But for us, we always say, on the you must want to be rich to get through the first grilling at Restoration Partners, you've got to work out what you want your entity to be worth and by when. And when we do that, we find lots of interesting things with people. For example, lots of people have never thought about the answer to the question. So we then say to them, when you go home to your husband or wife and say, I'm sorry I worked another 10-hour day today, and your husband or wife says, yeah, but why do you work so hard? You say, I don't know, because I don't know where I'm going. I don't know what I'm trying to achieve. That can't be right. You should be saying, darling, I'm trying to do this. I'm doing this rather because I'm trying to get this to be worth £10 million within 3 to 5 years' time, and then our lives will be transformed. It is worth making that sacrifice. So unless you've got the destination in mind, it's impossible, I would argue, to answer those other questions. So then the question comes back, which comes first? I say, measure the money in destination, and the rest just flows. If you do it the other way around, which is saying, if I bootstrap myself forever, that's a little bit like saying, well, I haven't filled the petrol tank up in my car, but I'm going to drive for a long time and hopefully I'll find a petrol station. Well, that is a journey, isn't it? That's a kind of a rambling way of going about something, but it isn't quite the cut and thrust of commercial dynamism that I've been talking about in Rich versus Right. So I would turn it on its head and say, figure out where you're trying to get to, measured in time and in money, and then the rest of the answers become much easier. Thank you.